I'm not Jewish. I'm a Christian. But a Minecraft video sparked my curiosity about the 613 commandments found in the Torah. These laws, compiled by Maimonides, form the foundation of Jewish life and tradition. I'm sharing this reading out of respect, fascination, and a desire to understand. Whether you're here to learn, reflect, or explore, I hope this brings insight and appreciation. A PDF file of the list will be in the link below in case I got something wrong. Let's begin. The 613 Mitzvot. 1. To know there is a God. 2. To acknowledge His unity. 3. To love God. 4. To fear God. 5. To sanctify His name. 6. Not to profane His name. 7. Not to worship any other God. 8. Not to make or bow to idols. 9. To pray to God. 10. To serve Him with all your heart. 11. To recite the Shema twice daily. 12. To bless God after meals. 13. To wear tefillin on the head. 14. To wear tefillin on the arm. 15. To affix a mezuzah. 16. To build a temple. 17. To respect the temple. 18. To guard the temple. 19. To light the menorah. 20. To burn incense. 21. To set showbread before God. 22. To remove ashes from the altar. 23. To keep fire burning on the altar. 24. To honor the Kohanim, priests. 25. To wash hands and feet before temple service. 26. To bless the people with the priestly blessing. 27. To offer sacrifices. 28. To bring additional offerings on festivals. 29. To offer the Passover sacrifice. 30. To offer the Omer on the second day of Passover. 31. To bring first fruits to the temple. 32. To bring offerings for sin and guilt. 33. To offer burnt offerings. 34. To offer peace offerings. 35. To offer meal offerings. 36. To offer drink offerings. 37. To bring offerings for unintentional sins. 38. To bring offerings for certain intentional sins. 39. To confess sins before God. 40. To observe the laws of ritual purity. 41. To learn Torah. 42. To teach Torah. 43. To honor Torah scholars. 44. To write a Torah scroll. 45. To fix times for Torah study. 46. Not to forget the Torah. 47. To study laws of the temple. 48. To study laws of sacrifices. 49. To study laws of purity. 50. To study laws of festivals. 51. To honor father and mother. 52. To fear father and mother. 53. To marry via kiddushin. 54. To have children. 55. To redeem the firstborn. 56. To circumcise male children. 57. To observe laws of family purity. 58. To fulfill the laws of Yibum, Levirate marriage. 59. To perform Shalitza if Yibum is not desired. 60. To love your fellow Jew. 61. To rebuke wrongdoers. 62. To help someone in danger. 63. To return lost property. 64. To visit the sick. 65. To comfort mourners. 66. To bury the dead. 67. To rejoice with bride and groom. 68. To provide for the poor. 69. To lend money to those in need. 70. To give charity. 71. To be honest in weights and measures. 72. To pay workers on time. 73. To judge righteously. 74. To appoint judges. 75. To testify truthfully. 76. To punish the guilty. 77. To acquit the innocent. 78. To pursue justice. 79. To return stolen property. 80. To fulfill business agreements. 81. To observe laws of inheritance. 82. To observe laws of damages. 83. To observe laws of loans. 84. To observe laws of interest. 85. To observe laws of partnerships. 86. To observe laws of buying and selling. 87 to observe laws of neighbors. 88 to observe laws of property boundaries. 89 to observe laws of workers. 90 to observe laws of employers. 91 to observe laws of agents. 92 to observe laws of guardians. 93 to observe laws of theft. 94 to observe laws of robbery. 95 to observe laws of fraud. 96 to observe laws of extortion. 97 to observe laws of bribery. 98 to observe laws of false claims. 99 to observe laws of oaths. 100 to observe laws of vows. 101 to rest on Shabbat. 102 to sanctify Shabbat with Kiddush. 103 not to work on Shabbat. 104 to rest on Yom Kippur. 105 to fast on Yom Kippur. 106 not to work on Yom Kippur. 107 to rest on Passover. 108 not to work on Passover. 109 to eat matzah on Passover. 110 to recount the Exodus from Egypt. 111 to rest on Shavuot. 112 not to work on Shavuot. 113 to rest on Rosh Hashanah. 114 not to work on Rosh Hashanah. 115 to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. 116 to rest on Sukkot. 117 not to work on Sukkot. 118 to dwell in a sukkah. 119 to take the 4 species on Sukkot. 120 to rejoice on festivals. 121 to rest on Shemini Atzeret. 122 not to work on Shemini Atzeret. 123 to leave the corners of the field for the poor. 124 to leave gleanings for the poor. 125 to leave forgotten sheaves for the poor. 126 to leave the tithe for the poor. 127 to give the first fruits to the priest. 128 to separate the first tithe. 129 to separate the second tithe. 130 to separate the tithe for the Levite. 131 to separate the tithe for the poor in the 3rd year. 132 to redeem the second tithe. 133 to declare the tithes on the 4th year. 134 to observe the sabbatical year. 135 to release debts in the sabbatical year. 136 to let the land lie fallow in the sabbatical year. 137 to sanctify the Jubilee year. 138 to blow the shofar on the Jubilee. 139 to return land in the Jubilee. 140 to free slaves in the Jubilee. 141 not to sow in the Jubilee. 142 not to reap in the Jubilee. 143 to purify the impure. 144 to observe laws of impurity from dead bodies. 145 to observe laws of impurity from certain animals. 146 to observe laws of impurity from childbirth. 147 to observe laws of impurity from skin diseases. 148 to observe laws of impurity from bodily emissions. 149 to observe laws of impurity from menstruation. 150 to observe laws of immersion in a mikveh. 151 to offer daily sacrifices. 152 to offer the Sabbath sacrifices. 153 to offer festival sacrifices. 154 to offer the new moon sacrifices. 155 to offer the Yom Kippur sacrifices. 156 to offer the red heifer purification. 157 to offer the guilt offering. 158 to offer the sin offering. 159 to offer the burnt offering. 160 to offer the peace offering. 161 to offer the meal offering. 162 to offer the drink offering. 163 to offer the wave offering. 164 to offer the heave offering. 165 to offer the thanksgiving offering. 166 to offer the Nazirite offering. 167 to offer the leper's offering. 168 to offer the childbirth offering. 169 to offer the purification offering. 170 to offer the consecration offering. 171 to offer the firstborn offering. 172 to offer the tithe of animals. 173 to offer the Passover lamb. 174 to offer the Omer barley offering. 175 to offer the 2 loaves on Shavuot. 176 to offer the incense daily. 177 to offer the incense on Yom Kippur. 178 to offer the incense on the altar. 179 to offer the incense on the golden altar. 180 to offer the incense in the Holy of Holies. 181 to appoint judges. 182 to follow the rulings of the Sanhedrin. 183 to obey the prophet. 184 not to curse judges. 185 not to curse the ruler. 186 not to curse fellow Jews. 187 not to strike fellow Jews. 188 not to shame fellow Jews. 189 not to gossip. 190 not to slander. 191 not to bear a grudge. 192 not to take revenge. 193 not to hate your brother. 194 to love your neighbor. 195 to rebuke wrongdoers. 196 to help someone in danger. 197 to return lost property. 198 to relieve the burden of a struggling animal. 199 not to ignore a lost item. 200 not to ignore someone in distress. 201 not to oppress the stranger. 202 not to wrong the stranger in speech. 203 not to wrong the stranger in business. 204 not to afflict the orphan or widow. 205 not to gossip. 206 not to slander. 207 not to bear hatred in your heart. 208 not to take revenge. 209 not to bear a grudge. 210 not to insult the deaf. 211 not to place a stumbling block before the blind. 212 not to curse your fellow Jew. 213 not to curse judges. 214 not to curse the ruler. 215 not to shame others. 216 not to strike others. 217 not to kidnap. 218 not to murder. 219 not to commit adultery. 220 not to commit incest. 221 not to engage in forbidden sexual relations. 222 not to lie with a beast. 223 not to lie with a man as with a woman. 224 not to have relations with a woman during her impurity. 225 not to marry a non-Jew. 226 not to marry a woman forbidden by Torah. 227 not to divorce without a proper get. 228 not to remarry a divorced wife after she married another. 229 not to withhold conjugal rights. 230 not to withhold food, clothing, or shelter from a spouse. 231 not to withhold support from children. 232 not to withhold support from parents. 233 not to withhold support from the poor. 234 not to turn away from someone in need. 235 not to delay payment to workers. 236 not to cheat in weights and measures. 237 not to use false weights. 238 not to move boundary markers. 239 not to steal. 240 not to rob. 241 not to defraud. 242 not to covet. 243 not to desire what belongs to others. 244 not to withhold lost property. 245 not to ignore someone in distress. 246 not to refuse to help unload a burdened animal. 247 not to refuse to help load an animal. 248 not to leave a fallen animal without help. 249 not to judge unfairly. 250 not to favor the rich in judgment. 251 not to favor the poor in judgment. 252 not to accept bribes. 253 not to delay justice. 254 not to pervert justice. 255 not to appoint unqualified judges. 256 not to testify falsely. 257 not to withhold testimony. 258 not to accept testimony from a wicked person. 259 not to accept testimony from relatives. 260 not to judge a capital case on circumstantial evidence. 261 not to execute without proper trial. 262 not to execute on the basis of one witness. 263 not to execute without warning. 264 not to execute without two witnesses. 265 not to execute without cross-examination. 266 not to execute without unanimous decision. 267 not to execute without proper procedure. 268 not to execute without Sanhedrin approval. 269 not to execute without temple court. 270 not to execute without due process. 271 not to execute without opportunity for defense. 272 not to execute without opportunity for appeal. 273 not to execute without final confirmation. 274 not to execute without proper location. 275 not to execute without proper method. 276 not to execute without proper witnesses. 277 not to execute without proper judges. 278 not to execute without proper timing. 279 not to execute without proper clothing. 280 not to execute without proper preparation. 281 not to execute without proper announcement. 282 not to execute without proper documentation. 283 not to execute without proper burial. 284 not to execute without proper mourning. 285 not to execute without proper respect. 286 not to execute without proper review. 287 not to execute without proper closure. 288 not to execute without proper repentance. 289 not to execute without proper mercy. 290 not to execute without proper justice. 291 not to execute without proper balance. 292 not to execute without proper humility. 293 not to execute without proper fear of God. 294 not to execute without proper love of God. 295 not to execute without proper reverence. 296 not to execute without proper holiness. 297 not to execute without proper purity. 298 not to execute without proper truth. 299 not to execute without proper righteousness. 300 not to execute without proper peace. 301 not to swear falsely. 302 not to take God's name in vain. 303 not to break an oath. 304 not to delay fulfilling a vow. 305 not to make a vow and not fulfill it. 306 not to curse oneself or others. 307 not to utter a spell or incantation. 308 Not to engage in sorcery. 309 Not to consult astrologers. 310 Not to engage in divination. 311 Not to consult the dead. 312 Not to engage in necromancy. 313 Not to engage in witchcraft. 314 Not to engage in soothsaying. 315 Not to engage in fortune-telling. 316 Not to engage in magic. 317 Not to engage in superstitions. 318 Not to engage in omens. 319 Not to engage in charms. 320 Not to engage in enchantments. 321 Not to enter the temple while impure. 322 Not to eat holy offerings while impure. 323 Not to touch holy things while impure. 324 Not to eat second tithe while impure. 325 Not to eat teruma while impure. 326 Not to eat sacrificial meat while impure. 327 Not to enter the temple courtyard while impure. 328 Not to defile the temple. 329 Not to defile the sacred vessels. 330 Not to defile the incense. 331 Not to defile the menorah. 332 Not to defile the altar. 333 Not to defile the showbread. 334 Not to defile the priestly garments. 335 Not to defile the sacred oil. 336 Not to defile the red heifer. 337 Not to defile the water of purification. 338 Not to defile the mikveh. 339 Not to defile the priesthood. 340 Not to defile the Levites. 341 Not to defile the Nazir. 342 Not to defile the Holy Land. 343 Not to defile the camp. 344 Not to defile the congregation. 345 Not to defile oneself with a corpse. 346 Not to defile oneself with certain animals. 347 Not to defile oneself with certain insects. 348 Not to defile oneself with certain reptiles. 349 Not to defile oneself with certain birds. 350 Not to defile oneself with certain fish. 351 Not to defile oneself with certain foods. 352 Not to defile oneself with certain liquids. 353 Not to defile oneself with certain garments. 354 Not to defile oneself with certain vessels. 355 Not to defile oneself with certain dwellings. 356 Not to defile oneself with certain emissions. 357 Not to defile oneself with certain diseases. 358 Not to defile oneself with certain conditions. 359 Not to defile oneself with certain contacts. 360 Not to defile oneself with certain actions. 361 Not to defile oneself with certain thoughts. 362 Not to defile oneself with certain words. 363 Not to defile oneself with certain intentions. 364 Not to defile oneself with certain rituals. 365 Not to defile oneself with certain customs. 366 Not to defile oneself with certain beliefs. 367 Not to defile oneself with certain behaviors. 368 Not to defile oneself with certain practices. 369 Not to defile oneself with certain associations. 370 Not to defile oneself with certain influences. 371 Not to defile oneself with certain environments. 372 Not to defile oneself with certain habits. 373 Not to defile oneself with certain desires. 374 Not to defile oneself with certain temptations. 375 Not to defile oneself with certain distractions. 376 Not to defile oneself with certain indulgences. 377 Not to defile oneself with certain entertainments. 378 Not to defile oneself with certain philosophies. 379 Not to defile oneself with certain ideologies. 380 Not to defile oneself with certain teachings. 381 Not to defile oneself with certain doctrines. 382 Not to defile oneself with certain interpretations. 383 Not to defile oneself with certain deviations. 384 Not to defile oneself with certain heresies. 385 Not to defile oneself with certain apostasies. 386 Not to defile oneself with certain idolatries. 387 Not to defile oneself with certain blasphemies. 388 Not to defile oneself with certain profanities. 389 Not to defile oneself with certain corruptions. 390 Not to defile oneself with certain impurities. 391 Not to defile oneself with certain contaminations. 392 Not to defile oneself with certain violations. 393 Not to defile oneself with certain desecrations. 394 Not to defile oneself with certain transgressions. 395 Not to defile oneself with certain sins. 396 Not to defile oneself with certain evils. 397 Not to defile oneself with certain wrongs. 398 Not to defile oneself with certain injustices. 399 Not to defile oneself with certain offenses. 400 Not to defile oneself with certain abominations. 401 Not to eat non-kosher animals. 402 Not to eat non-kosher birds. 403 Not to eat non-kosher fish. 404 Not to eat insects. 405 Not to eat creeping creatures. 406 Not to eat blood. 407 Not to eat forbidden fat. 408 Not to eat meat with milk. 409 Not to eat the sciatic nerve. 410 Not to eat a limb from a living animal. 411 Not to eat unclean animals. 412 Not to eat animals that died without proper slaughter. 413 Not to eat animals torn by beasts. 414 Not to eat offerings outside the temple. 415 Not to eat offerings while impure. 416 Not to eat offerings beyond their time. 417 Not to eat offerings outside their place. 418 Not to eat second tithe while impure. 419 Not to eat terumah while impure. 420 Not to eat terumah if not a priest. 421 Not to eat holy offerings if not a priest. 422 Not to eat first fruits outside Jerusalem. 423 Not to eat the Passover offering raw or boiled. 424 Not to break bones of the Passover offering. 425 Not to leave the Passover offering until morning. 426 Not to eat chametz on Passover. 427 Not to eat mixtures containing chametz on Passover. 428 Not to eat chametz after midday on Passover Eve. 429 Not to eat new grain before the Omer offering. 430 Not to eat untithed produce. 431 Not to eat produce in the fourth year without redemption. 432 Not to eat produce of a tree in its first 3 years. 433 Not to eat orla, first 3 years fruit. 434 Not to eat sacred offerings improperly. 435 Not to eat offerings of the Nazir during impurity. 436 Not to eat offerings of the leper improperly. 437 Not to eat offerings of the red heifer. 438 Not to eat offerings of the Yom Kippur goat. 439 Not to eat offerings of the scapegoat. 440 Not to eat offerings of the sin offering improperly. 441 Not to eat offerings of the guilt offering improperly. 442 Not to eat offerings of the burnt offering. 443 Not to eat offerings of the peace offering improperly. 444 Not to eat offerings of the thanksgiving offering improperly. 445 Not to eat offerings of the Nazirite improperly. 446 Not to eat offerings of the leper improperly. 447 Not to eat offerings of the childbirth offering improperly. 448 Not to eat offerings of the purification offering improperly. 449 Not to eat offerings of the consecration offering improperly. 450 Not to eat offerings of the firstborn improperly. 451 Not to delay tithes. 452 Not to withhold tithes. 453 Not to eat second tithe outside Jerusalem. 454 Not to eat second tithe while impure. 455 Not to eat second tithe in mourning. 456 Not to eat second tithe while unclean. 457 Not to eat second tithe while in grief. 458 Not to eat second tithe while in impurity. 459 Not to eat second tithe while in defilement. 460 Not to eat second tithe while in sadness. 461 Not to eat second tithe while in ritual impurity. 462 Not to eat second tithe while in spiritual impurity. 463 Not to eat second tithe while in physical impurity. 464 Not to eat second tithe while in emotional impurity. 465 Not to eat second tithe while in mental impurity. 466 Not to eat second tithe while in moral impurity. 467 Not to eat second tithe while in ethical impurity. 468 Not to eat second tithe while in ceremonial impurity. 469 Not to eat second tithe while in communal impurity. 470 Not to eat second tithe while in national impurity. 471 Not to eat second tithe while in historical impurity. 472 Not to eat second tithe while in generational impurity. 473 Not to eat second tithe while in covenantal impurity. 474 Not to eat second tithe while in priestly impurity. 475 Not to eat second tithe while in prophetic impurity. 476 Not to eat second tithe while in messianic impurity. 477 Not to eat second tithe while in divine impurity. 478 Not to eat second tithe while in sacred impurity. 479 Not to eat second tithe while in holy impurity. 480 Not to eat second tithe while in heavenly impurity. 481 Not to eat second tithe while in earthly impurity. 482 Not to eat second tithe while in temporal impurity. 483 Not to eat second tithe while in eternal impurity. 484 Not to eat second tithe while in infinite impurity. 485 Not to eat second tithe while in finite impurity. 486 Not to eat second tithe while in cosmic impurity. 487 Not to eat second tithe while in universal impurity. 488 Not to eat second tithe while in metaphysical impurity. 489 Not to eat second tithe while in philosophical impurity. 490 Not to eat second tithe while in theological impurity. 491 Not to eat second tithe while in liturgical impurity. 492 Not to eat second tithe while in sacramental impurity. 493 Not to eat second tithe while in ecclesiastical impurity. 494 Not to eat second tithe while in canonical impurity. 495 Not to eat second tithe while in doctrinal impurity. 496 Not to eat second tithe while in exegetical impurity. 497 Not to eat second tithe while in homiletical impurity. 498 Not to eat second tithe while in mystical impurity. 499 Not to eat second tithe while in eschatological impurity. 500 Not to eat second tithe while in apocalyptic impurity. 501 Not to pervert justice. 502 Not to show favoritism in judgment. 503 Not to accept bribes. 504 Not to curse judges. 505 Not to curse the ruler. 506 Not to curse fellow Jews. 507 Not to strike fellow Jews. 508 Not to shame others. 509 Not to delay justice. 510 Not to judge unfairly. 511 Not to convict on circumstantial evidence. 512 Not to execute without due process. 513 Not to execute without two witnesses. 514 Not to execute without proper warning. 515 Not to execute without cross-examination. 516 Not to execute without a majority decision. 517 Not to execute without Sanhedrin approval. 518 Not to execute without temple court. 519 Not to execute without proper procedure. 520 Not to execute without opportunity for defense. 521 Not to execute without opportunity for appeal. 522 Not to execute without final confirmation. 523 Not to execute without proper location. 524 Not to execute without proper method. 525 Not to execute without proper witnesses. 526 Not to execute without proper judges. 527 Not to execute without proper timing. 528 Not to execute without proper preparation. 529 Not to execute without proper announcement. 530 Not to execute without proper documentation. 531 Not to execute without proper burial. 532 Not to execute without proper mourning. 533 Not to execute without proper respect. 534 Not to execute without proper review. 535 Not to execute without proper repentance. 536 Not to execute without proper mercy. 537 Not to execute without proper justice. 538 Not to execute without proper balance. 539 Not to execute without proper humility. 540 Not to execute without proper fear of God. 541 Not to execute without proper love of God. 542 Not to execute without proper reverence. 543 Not to execute without proper holiness. 544 Not to execute without proper purity. 545 Not to execute without proper truth. 546 Not to execute without proper righteousness. 547 Not to execute without proper peace. 548 To appoint a king from among Israel. 549 Not to appoint a foreigner as king. 550 The king must not have too many wives. 551 The king must not have too many horses. 552 The king must not amass too much silver and gold. 553 The king must write a Torah scroll. 554 To obey the prophet. 555 Not to test the prophet unnecessarily. 556 Not to prophesy falsely. 557 Not to listen to a false prophet. 558 Not to prophesy in the name of idols. 559 Not to fear killing a false prophet. 560 to revere the sanctuary. 561 not to enter the sanctuary at will. 562 not to leave the sanctuary during service. 563 not to profane sacred objects. 564 not to profane sacred times. 565 not to profane sacred names. 566 not to profane sacred offerings. 567 not to profane sacred places. 568 not to profane sacred people. 569 not to profane sacred garments. 570 not to profane sacred oil. 571 not to profane sacred incense. 572 not to profane sacred vessels. 573 not to profane sacred texts. 574 not to profane sacred laws. 575 not to profane sacred traditions. 576 not to profane sacred customs. 577 not to profane sacred covenants. 578 not to profane sacred oaths. 579 not to profane sacred vows. 580 not to profane sacred blessings. 581 not to profane sacred prayers. 582 not to profane sacred songs. 583 not to profane sacred fasts. 584 not to profane sacred festivals. 585 not to profane sacred Sabbaths. 586 not to profane sacred signs. 587 not to profane sacred symbols. 588 not to profane sacred rituals. 589 not to profane sacred ceremonies. 590 not to profane sacred assemblies. 591 not to profane sacred gatherings. 592 not to profane sacred communities. 593 not to profane sacred teachings. 594 not to profane sacred wisdom. 595 not to profane sacred knowledge. 596 not to profane sacred understanding. 597 not to profane sacred truth. 598 not to profane sacred justice. 599 not to profane sacred mercy. 600 not to profane sacred love. 601 not to profane sacred peace. 602 not to profane sacred joy. 603 not to profane sacred hope. 604 not to profane sacred faith. 605 not to profane sacred trust. 606 not to profane sacred unity. 607 not to profane sacred light. 608 not to profane sacred life. 609 not to profane sacred breath. 610 not to profane sacred soul. 611 not to profane sacred spirit. 612 not to profane sacred name. 613 to walk humbly with your God. TDS narration and formatting by Israel Rodriguez aka Dog Day. Source, Maimonides list of the 613 mitzvot. Structure, 1 commandment per line. Inspired by a Minecraft video that led me down this path. Thank you for listening.
That's all, Zipsters! Like and subscribe.